A dust-covered stagecoach rolled to a stop before the small wooden ranch house. Wind tugged at the dry grass. On the porch stood a man gripping his hat, heart pounding in his chest. Abel Harkin had waited 6 long months for this. Half a year writing to Clara Weller, a woman who promised kindness, said she understood men like him. Shy men. Men who'd never laid hands on a woman. But it wasn't Clara who stepped down. What emerged was something else entirely. A woman towering nearly 2 heads over him, built like a frontier ox and dressed in worn leather patched at the seams. One hand gripped a scuffed suitcase. She stared down at him. He looked up, words caught somewhere between breath and disbelief. The silence stretched, waited with something neither of them yet understood. Neither of them knew this wasn't fate. It was design. Someone out there had planned this swap, someone who stood to gain by making Abel appear weak and alone. From a ridge beyond the ranch, Clyde Barker watched the scene unfold through a spyglass, a cold grin creeping across his face. Abel stood frozen, the letter from Clara still tucked in his pocket, the greeting he'd practiced all week dying on his tongue. The woman in front of him wasn't just tall, she was solid, like a force of nature. Her long legs could have crossed half the pasture in a few strides. Her arms, corded with muscle, flexed beneath the fringed leather. Her hair fell wild and dark over her shoulders. When her deep brown eyes landed on him, he didn't feel like a host. He felt like prey. The driver, Hank Dobbs, tossed her case onto the dirt and flicked the reins, not bothering with a word. The horses lunged forward, kicking up dust, eager to be away from whatever mess they'd just dropped off. There was no one else. Abel's nearest neighbor was a half-day ride. The town where he'd posted his ad? 3 hours south. No one was there to witness this moment except the 2 of them and the vast emptiness surrounding the ranch. She didn't move. Just stood, suitcase at her feet, watching him with an unreadable expression. Not anger, not confusion. Something deeper. Something that looked a lot like resignation. He should say something. Anything. But his throat locked up. He'd prepared for bashfulness, for awkward pauses. He hadn't prepared for her, for the way she seemed to block out the sky itself. Then she spoke, her voice unexpectedly smooth, low. "You're Abel Harkin." Not a question, a statement. He nodded, unable to speak. "I'm Nita." She bent down, lifted the suitcase with one hand like it was nothing. "There's been a mistake." Those words should have relieved him, should have given him an out, a way to explain it all. But instead he found himself asking, "Where were you supposed to go?" Something flickered behind her eyes. "Nowhere." She glanced past him at the house, the barn, the 3 horses grazing near the creek. "This was the address I was given. But you were expecting someone else." "Clara," he whispered. "Her name was Clara. She was—" He trailed off, unable to finish. She was supposed to be small. Delicate, white. Everything you're not. Nita's jaw tightened. She didn't need to hear the rest. She already knew. "I can wait until morning. Then I'll be on my way." "Wait." He didn't mean to say it so sharply, but it stopped her. She had one foot on the porch step, posture rigid, head high like someone used to being turned away, but determined never to flinch. "Where will you go?" he asked. She said nothing. In that silence, he understood. She had nowhere to go. Clara had other choices. Nita had only this wrong address, that scuffed suitcase, and maybe a sliver of hope that someone might let her stay. The sun was sinking, the sky bleeding orange and gold. In an hour, night would fall hard, In two, the air would bite. He thought about sending her away, thought about what folks would say, thought about how small he felt next to her, like a boy trying to play rancher. Then he thought about her alone in the dark, with nothing but silence and rejection. "There's a room in the back," he said, voice low. "It's not much, but it's clean. You can stay the night. In the morning, we'll figure it out." She turned toward him, studying his face, and for the first time, something in her softened. Not gratitude, exactly. Something more complicated. As if, for a flicker of a second, she truly saw him. "One night," she said. "One night," he echoed. But as she walked past, her arm brushed his, and he felt the difference between them in a way that left heat crawling up his neck. And deep down, he already knew. One night was a lie they were both telling themselves. Far off on the hills, Clyde Barker lowered the spyglass and grinned wider. Everything was unfolding just as he'd planned. The same question as yesterday. Nita set the coffee pot down with a hard thud that echoed through the quiet kitchen. "Why do you keep asking that?" Abel looked at her steady. "Because you keep not answering." She stared at him, unblinking, and for the first time something in her cracked, just for a second. Not anger, not pride. Pain. "My people cast me out." The words hit like a bullet. Her voice didn't waver, but each syllable came out sharper than the last. "The agency took every cent I had just to get me here. I've got no kin, no tribe, no home." Abel felt the air pull from his lungs. Cast out. He knew solitude, but he'd chosen it. Hers had been forced upon her. "Why?" he asked before he could stop himself. Her jaw clenched. "Because I'm too tall, too strong, too different. Apache women are expected to be one way, and I'm not that way. The men feared me. The women shunned me, so they sent me away." She picked up her coffee, holding it with both hands like a shield. "The agency promised a new start. Said I'd find a husband who wouldn't care about how I looked or what I could lift." "They lied." "I didn't know," Abel said quietly. "Of course you didn't." She turned to him then, her eyes sharp, cutting through him like a blade. "You wanted Clara. Sweet, small, someone soft and simple, someone who made you feel like a man. It stung, because it was true." "Yes," he admitted, shoulders slumping. "I wanted that." Something shifted in her face. Not scorn, not bitterness. Respect, maybe, or the start of it. "Then we agree," she said, her voice even. "I'll finish this coffee and go." But before he could form a reply, the sound of pounding hooves cut through the morning air. Fast, urgent. Nita was already at the window, moving with startling speed. Her whole body changed. No longer wounded, no longer defensive. Predatory. "You expecting anyone?" she asked, eyes scanning the ridgeline. "No," Abel said, joining her at the window. 5 riders were bearing down on the ranch. He recognized 3, settlement men from the south. The other 2 were strangers. But the one leading the group? Abel knew him. Clyde Barker. The man who'd taken his money. The man who was supposed to deliver Clara. And judging by the smug look on his face, this wasn't a visit to exchange pleasantries. "That's the one who sent me here," Nita said, voice dropping low and dangerous. "That's the man who was supposed to send me Clara," Abel murmured. Their eyes met, and the truth hung heavy between them. They'd both been played. Clyde dismounted like he owned the dirt beneath his boots. Fancy coat, polished spurs, grinning like a fox in the henhouse. The others didn't dismount. They just sat their saddles with hands far too close to their belts. Abel stepped out onto the porch before Clyde could reach the door. He felt Nita's presence behind him, just inside, watching. "Mr. Barker," he said coldly. "Wasn't expecting you." "No, I bet you weren't." Clyde's eyes drifted past him, landing on the figure behind the window. His grin curled. "Looks like you got your delivery. Hope she's everything you dreamed of." The mockery wasn't even subtle. "There's been a mistake," Abel said, jaw tight. "She's not Clara." "No mistake." Clyde pulled out a folded paper from his coat, slow as molasses. "Contract says I deliver a bride. Doesn't say which one." He gestured toward the house. "That one's strong as an ox. Good for land work. You should be thankful." One of the riders behind him, Dusty Maris, Abel thought, let out a chuckle. Abel's fists clenched. "I paid for Clara," Abel said, voice low. "I wrote to her for 6 months." "Clara changed her mind," Clyde shrugged. "It happens. But a deal's a deal, Abel. I gave you a bride. Now let's talk about this land." And there it was. Abel had known it was coming. He'd felt it in his gut since the night before, when that spyglass caught sunlight on the ridge. "This land ain't for sale." "I didn't say it was," Clyde replied, slipping the contract away. "But there are folks mighty interested in this stretch. Good water runs through it. Shame to see one man waste it. It's still not for sale." Clyde's smile thinned to a razor's edge. "You sure? Word travels fast in town, Abel. Folks see an Apache woman living under your roof. They might stop doing business. You might find things hard." "That a threat?" "Just an observation." Clyde turned as if to leave, then paused. "Though I will say, if something were to happen to you, out here, with no one around to vouch for you, well, the land would end up at auction real quick. Accidents happen." The riders shifted. One, Roe Carter, let his hand fall a little closer to his holster. Abel didn't speak. He didn't need to. The door behind him creaked open. Nita stepped out. And just like that, the air changed. She didn't speak, didn't blink, just stood tall beside him, taller than any man on that porch, her shoulders square, her gaze locked on Clyde like a hawk eyeing a snake. Clyde blinked and took a half step back. His horse sidestepped uneasily. Even the animals knew better. "You should leave," Nita said. Her voice was soft, but there was steel in it. Clyde tried to cover the crack in his composure, but Abel saw it. Real fear. "The savage speaks," Clyde muttered, retreating to his horse. "How charming." He mounted, eyes sharp and hateful. 3 days, Abel. Sell or else." He tipped his hat with mock politeness. "Accidents happen." They rode off in a trail of dust. Abel stood frozen, fists trembling, not with fear, but rage. He'd never felt so powerless. "He planned this," Nita said, eyes still fixed on the road. "He knew what sending me here would do. Knew how it would weaken you." He wanted to deny it, but she was right. One man alone was a problem. One man with an Apache woman? A target. 3 days, Abel muttered. Nita looked at him with something sharp and calculating. "Or we give them a reason to be afraid." Before he could ask what she meant, she turned and walked back inside, and Abel stood there, dust on his boots, the echo of hooves still in the air, and the gut-deep feeling that whatever this was between them, it had just crossed a dangerous line. But when Abel gathered his tools and headed toward the north pasture, Nita followed without a word. She didn't ask for permission, just picked up the extra hammer and fell into step beside him. Her long stride forced him to walk quicker than he normally did, and though the silence stretched between them, it wasn't uncomfortable. He thought about telling her she didn't need to help, that this was his land, his burden. But the words withered when he saw how her eyes scanned the busted fence line with the calm focus of someone who knew hard labor down to the bone. They worked without speaking for the first hour. Abel dug out the splintered, rotted posts, while Nita hauled in new ones from the stack near the barn. Each post must have weighed close to 70 pounds, but she carried two at once, one balanced on each shoulder, walking the uneven ground like it was nothing. He tried not to watch, tried not to let the sting of inadequacy settle in as he wrestled the post-hole digger through stubborn, sun-baked earth. By the second hour, his palms were blistered raw. Abel had never been built for muscle. What he had was persistence, patience. But watching Nita drive a post into the ground with 3 clean swings of the hammer made him feel like a boy pretending to be a man. She caught him looking, paused mid-swing. "You dig better than I do." It was a lie. They both knew it. But something in her voice, soft, dry, a flicker of kindness, made him meet her eyes. She was offering him dignity, and it hit him harder than he expected. "You don't have to help," he murmured. "I know." She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand. "But I'm here. Might as well make myself useful." They returned to work, but the air between them had changed. It was no longer heavy. There was room in the silence now. As the sun began its slow descent, golden light spilled across the land, and Abel felt something in his shoulders relax for the first time since she'd arrived. "Why ranching?" Nita asked suddenly. Abel paused. The question should have stung, but her tone held no ridicule, only curiosity. "I inherited this place," he said, leaning on the digger. "My uncle, Gus McCready, had no family left but me. I could have sold it, could have gone to the city, but something about this dirt felt like mine. Out here, I didn't have to pretend to be someone I wasn't." "Alone," Nita said. "Yeah," he nodded. Alone felt safer than not belonging. She was quiet for a beat. "My mother was Apache," she said. "My father was a white man, tall, real tall. That's where I get it. They called him a traitor, me too eventually." She lifted another post like it weighed nothing. "At first they accepted me, but when I grew taller than the boys, stronger than the warriors' sons, they stopped pretending. I wasn't a daughter of the tribe. I was the proof my mother made a mistake." Abel felt something twist in his chest. "That's why they cast you out." She didn't answer, just slammed the post into the dirt harder than necessary. "I thought maybe among your people size wouldn't matter. Thought I could finally belong." She let out a dry laugh, but there was no joy in it. "Then I saw your face when I stepped down from that carriage." The shame hit Abel like a slap. "I'm sorry." "Don't be." She looked at him, softer this time. "At least you're honest. Most folks just whisper and stare." The sun kissed the horizon. They'd replaced 6 posts, and the day's labor was done, but neither of them moved to leave. "I never fit anywhere either," Abel said quietly. "Too small, too quiet, too soft. Never enough of what a man's supposed to be." Nita studied him, and for once, he didn't feel like she was measuring him against anything. Her gaze held no judgment. "Maybe that's why Clyde Barker put us together," she murmured. "Two people easy to discard, easy to control." "Or," Abel said before he could stop himself, "maybe two people who don't belong anywhere might belong with each other." The words hung there. He couldn't believe he'd said them aloud. But she didn't laugh. Her eyes widened, her breath caught just slightly, and then glass shattered. They both turned. Smoke billowed up from the barn. Abel ran first. His chest pounded like a war drum. The horses were in there, all 3. If the flames reached the hay, they'd have no chance. Nita was faster, Her legs ate the distance. She yanked her shirt up over her mouth and dove straight into the rising smoke. Abel followed, but the heat hit like a wall. The fire had started at the back, flames licking high up the beams. Smoke choked his lungs, blurred his eyes. He could barely see 3 feet ahead. He heard Nata's voice somewhere inside, low, steady. Then the frantic squeals of panicked horses. The first horse barreled past him, eyes wild. Nita's hand gripped its mane, guiding it out. Somehow she'd calmed it enough to break the stall. She turned and vanished back into the inferno. Abel stumbled forward, coughing, useless. A second horse thundered by. Nita again, her voice murmuring in words he didn't understand. Apache words, gentle and commanding at once. One horse left. He pushed deeper, ducking under smoke. A beam cracked overhead, raining sparks. In the flicker of light, he saw Nita grappling with the final horse, a stallion bucking wildly, too scared to flee. She couldn't get near the latch. Abel didn't think. He stepped forward, talking soft and slow, the way he always did with animals when no one was around to hear. The horse's ears flicked, still afraid, still unpredictable. But it heard him. It remembered him. He edged closer, hands out, reached the bolt and slid it free. Nita was there in a flash, grabbing the halter, bracing her boots against the floor, using her strength to turn the animal's head toward freedom. It fought her, but she held. Muscles straining, she pushed it, guided it through smoke and fire until it burst into the night. They stumbled out behind it, coughing, heaving, coated in soot. The barn roared behind them, engulfed. Gone. Abel dropped to his knees in the dirt, lungs seared, hands trembling. The barn, the hay, the tools, everything he'd worked for, gone in minutes, and Nita, who had no stake in any of it, had risked herself to save it all. The fire had left behind nothing but blackened beams and glowing embers. The barn was gone. The tools, the hay, months of work, reduced to ash. Abel knew the damage would set him back for months, maybe longer. Nita stood beside him, breath coming in heavy bursts. Soot streaked her face, her hair tangled, her arms covered in grime. She looked like she'd walked straight out of a battlefield. Fierce, unyielding, and stronger than anything he'd ever seen. While he knelt in the dirt, shaken and lost, she stood tall like the storm hadn't touched her. "This wasn't no accident," she said, her voice rough from smoke. He didn't argue. She was right. The fire had come too soon, too neatly after Clyde Barker's warning. This was just the opening strike, the first blow in a quiet war. "They'll come back," Abel murmured. "Next time they won't stop at fire." Nita looked down at him. There was steel in her eyes. "Then we make 'em wish they never did." She reached out her hand. He hesitated, staring at the strength in her fingers, the ash pressed into her skin. Then he took it, let her pull him to his feet like it was nothing. They stood there, still holding on. Abel felt something shift inside him, deep and irreversible. She'd gone into that fire, for horses that weren't hers, for land that wasn't hers, for a man she barely knew. "Why?" he asked, voice cracking. "Why would you risk yourself for me?" She didn't let go of his hand. "Because," she said, "for the first time in my life, someone didn't look at me like a problem to fix. You gave me shelter when you could have sent me packing. You treated me like a person, not a mistake." She gave his hand a light squeeze. He felt the calluses in her palm, the grit beneath her fingernails. "And I'm tired," she whispered. "Tired of running from people who hate me for being different." Behind them, the fire hissed. In the distance, the horses had quieted near the creek, still alive. Still safe. Abel looked at her, really looked, and saw not the woman who'd ruined his plans, but the one who'd just saved everything that mattered. "Stay," he said. "Not just for one night. Stay." Nita's eyes searched his face, cautious, unreadable. "You know what that means? Clyde will use it against you. Folks in town will turn their backs." "I know," Abel said. And he did. But in that moment, with her hand in his, and his barn still smoking, the choice was simple. Stay anyway. She smiled. A small, quiet thing. But it changed everything. And somewhere out in the darkness, someone was watching. Someone who'd set the fire. Someone who'd underestimated what two lonely souls could build when they finally stopped running. The fight had only just begun. But Abel Harkin wasn't alone anymore. The next day, they prepared. Nita moved through the property like she'd been born on it. She checked every blind spot, every window, every line of sight, turned the homestead into a fortress with nothing but rope, scrap metal, and instinct. Abel watched her and felt helpless. She was the warrior. He was just a quiet man who talked to horses. By nightfall, the air had turned cold. They sat outside by a small fire, not ready to sleep inside where the smoke still lingered from the barn. Coyotes howled in the hills. Stars hung bright and sharp overhead. Nita was sharpening a knife she'd found in a drawer. The stone sang with each pass of the blade. "They'll come," she said. "Tomorrow maybe, or the day after. Clyde won't wait long." Abel poked the fire with a stick. "I'm sorry you got dragged into this." "I chose to stay," she replied, not looking up. "You shouldn't have to fight my battles. These are my battles now." She glanced at him, eyes gleaming in the firelight. "Clyde used me to break you down. That makes it personal." They sat in silence. Abel wanted to say more, wanted to tell her how he felt, what it meant to have her here. But the words caught like burrs in his throat. Nita set down the knife and whetstone. "You should sleep. I'll keep watch. You need rest too. I'm used to sleeping light." She stood and stretched, her silhouette cutting clean against the stars. Abel stood too, meaning to go inside, but she caught his arm suddenly and pulled him down just as something whistled past his head. A rock. It hit the house behind them, splintering wood. Nita leapt up, scanning the ridgeline. "There!" she hissed, pointing. Abel saw them. 2, maybe 3 figures in the dark. Another rock flew. This one aimed at Nita. She dodged it without effort, but it pulled her away from him. And in that second, he understood the plan. They were being split apart. Rocks came faster now. Nita moved like water, graceful and uncatchable, but the attackers kept her moving, kept her drifting from the house. One figure peeled off, circling around, flanking. Abel didn't hesitate. He grabbed the bucket of water beside the fire and dumped it fast. The flames died. Darkness fell. The rocks stopped. Blinded, the attackers hesitated. Abel moved quickly. He knew this land better than they ever would. He slipped through the dark toward where he'd seen the figure moving. He found the man crouched behind a boulder, ready to lunge. Abel didn't fight him head-on. He couldn't win that way. Instead, he scooped up a handful of dirt and hurled it into the man's face. The man howled, stumbled, and then Nita was there. One hard punch. The man crumpled. The other 2 vanished into the dark. Nita turned to him, chest heaving. "You put out the fire." "They were using it to see you," Abel said. "So I took away their eyes." She looked at him differently then. Not with gratitude, but something deeper. She stepped in close, her hands rising to cradle his face, soot-streaked and trembling. "You saved me," she whispered. Not by being strong, not by being violent, just by being smart. Abel's heart beat like thunder. She was so close. He could smell the smoke tangled in her hair. I'm not strong like you, he said. No, she replied. You're better. You see things. Then she kissed him. Soft. Curious. A kiss that didn't belong to war or fire, but to something new, something rising from the ashes. When she pulled away, her eyes searched his face. Was that wrong? No, he rasped. That was perfect. She smiled, and something clicked into place inside him. With a man knocked out cold beside them, and danger still breathing somewhere in the dark, Abel Harkin felt more whole than he'd ever been. We need to end this, Nita said, voice steady. Abel nodded, something sharp and cold forming in his chest. Then let's take the fight to Clyde. They rode into the settlement at high noon, when the sun was sharp overhead and shadows had nowhere to hide. Abel Harkin rode his smallest horse. Nita walked beside him. No horse could carry her frame comfortably. The townsfolk stopped what they were doing. Whispers followed like a dust trail down Main Street. Clyde Barker's office waited at the end of the road, a 2-story building built more for appearances than necessity, a monument to a man who liked to be noticed. Abel dismounted, tied the reins with hands that no longer trembled. Yesterday, he'd been afraid. Today, he was done being afraid. Nita didn't knock. She pushed the door open like she owned it. Clyde looked up from his desk. Surprise flashed across his face, quick and sharp, before that familiar snake oil smile took its place. Harkin, he drawled. Didn't expect you. Thought you'd be packing up by now. We came to talk terms, Abel said, stepping into the center of the room. Nita moved to the doorframe behind him, blocking the exit like a shadow made of muscle. You want my land? Abel continued. Let's talk about what it's really worth. Clyde leaned back, smug. Finally seeing sense, huh? Knew you were a smart man. He pulled a document from a drawer and slid it across the desk. It's a fair offer, more than enough to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere more suited to you. Abel picked up the paper. Read the number. It wasn't even half what the land was worth. This is what you call fair? Generous, given your situation. Living with a savage? You're not exactly in a strong position, friend. That smile widened. Take the deal, or watch what's left of your life go up in smoke. Your choice. I've got another idea, Abel said, voice calm. I tell everyone in this town what you did. That you sent the wrong woman on purpose. That you hired men to throw rocks at us in the dark. That you burned my barn to force me off land you meant to steal. Clyde laughed. Who's gonna believe you? A timid little rancher and his Apache woman against a respected businessman? You'll be laughed out of town. Nita moved. In a blink, she crossed the room, grabbed him by the collar, and lifted him clean off the ground like he weighed nothing. His boots left the floor. His face turned pale. Call me that again, she said, voice as calm as a hanging rope. And I'll show you exactly what this savage can do. Abel pulled a folded paper from his coat. The man you sent last night, the one Nita put down. He talked when he woke up, signed a statement. He unfolded it slowly, deliberately. Says you hired him and his brothers. Says you paid him to harass us. Says you promised a share of the land when I gave up. Clyde's expression cracked. That's nothing. One criminal's word against mine? Maybe, Abel nodded. But I've also got this. He pulled out a second paper. A letter. From Clara Weller. The real Clara. Wrote to me 3 days ago. Said she never got more than 2 of my letters. Said the agency told her I changed my mind. He stared Clyde down. You intercepted our correspondence. Made sure I never heard from her. Then you sent Nita, knowing it'd make me vulnerable. You used her." Clyde's skin glistened with sweat. "You've got no proof I did that." "I've got her letters. I've got your handwriting on the agency forms. I've got a man ready to testify, and—" Abel tilted his head toward the window. "I've got half the damn settlement watching." Clyde looked. Faces stared through the glass. The crowd had gathered, drawn by voices, by heat, by spectacle. Abel stepped closer. His voice dropped to a whisper. "Here's my offer. You sign over the water rights you came for. You leave this land and never come back. And I don't walk these papers over to the marshal 2 towns east, the one who's been looking for proof of land fraud." "You're bluffing," Clyde whispered. Abel smiled. It wasn't kind. "Try me." Nita lowered Clyde to the floor, but didn't let go. The message was clear. Defeated, Clyde reached into a drawer, pulled out the deed, and signed it with trembling hands. "Get out of my territory," Abel said, voice flat. Clyde grabbed his coat and bolted, pushing past the onlookers gathered outside. Inside the office, silence fell. The deed was in Abel's hands. The land and the truth were finally his. Nita looked at him, something like awe in her eyes. "You planned all that?" "You taught me," Abel said, turning the signed deed over in his fingers. "Strength comes in different forms. I used mine." She kissed him then, right there in that office, with half the town watching through the windows, and Abel kissed her back, unapologetic, unashamed. They'd won together. 2 weeks later, Abel Harkin and Nita stood beneath open sky, facing each other in front of a traveling minister. There was no church. The local one had made it clear. An Apache woman wasn't welcome. So they stood on Abel's land, the creek gurgling behind them, the rebuilt barn rising in quiet defiance. No guests, no music, just the 2 of them, and a minister who didn't want to be there but took the money anyway. Nita wore a pale blue dress she'd stitched herself from fabric Abel brought back from town. When she first put it on, she'd looked into the mirror like she couldn't believe what she saw. A bride. Abel wore the best shirt he owned, the one he'd saved for Clara. It felt right wearing it now, for the woman who was never supposed to matter, but had become everything. The minister rushed the words, barely pausing at the vows. Abel hardly heard any of it. He was watching her, the way her eyes never left his, the way her smile curved just for him. "Do you take this woman to be your wife?" "I do," Abel said. His voice didn't shake. "Do you take this man to be your husband?" "I do," Nita said, steady and sure. They had no rings, couldn't afford them after the fire. But Nita had woven 2 bracelets, leather and horsehair. Simple, strong. She tied one to his wrist. He tied one to hers. "By the authority vested in me," the minister said quickly, already gathering his things, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." He left within minutes, his discomfort trailing behind him. But Abel and Nita stood rooted in the dirt, tethered not by gold or ceremony, but by survival, by grit, by the fire they'd walked through side by side. They hadn't just survived. They had chosen each other. And that made all the difference. Abel Harkin and Nita stood side by side along the creek bed, bound not just by vows, but by something older than any law this wild land still honored. "So," Nita said softly, her gaze resting on him with that same quiet tenderness she'd shown since their first kiss beneath the cottonwood trees. "What now?" she asked. Abel looked out across the land, the horizon gold with promise. "Now we build something." And they did. Over the coming months, the ranch changed in ways Abel never thought possible. Nita's unshakable strength meant no job was too much. They built a new corral with their bare hands, opened more pasture for the stock, and began drawing up plans for a bigger house. Abel's deep knowledge of the land and calm with animals brought a quiet prosperity neither of them had dared to hope for. The settlement kept its distance. Some folks still crossed the street when Nita walked through town. Others whispered like ghosts behind their backs. But a few, just a few, saw what they had made together and understood it. Something real, something built on grit and grace, something that looked a lot like love. 6 months after the wedding, Clara Weller's letter arrived. She'd married a banker back east. Said she was happy. Wished Abel well. He read it once and fed it to the fire without a word. That man, the one who'd once needed a fragile woman to feel worthy, was ash now. The man he'd become stood beside a woman who could lift him over her shoulder if she had to. A woman who leaned on his quiet strength, just as he leaned on her raw power. That man he liked. Nita had found her place too. Not with the Red Mesa clan, and not with the townsfolk who never truly saw her. But here, on this stretch of land, with this man, the one who never tried to shrink her, tame her, or make her smaller than she was. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the rimrock, painting the land they'd bled to defend in warm firelight, they stood together. Nita's hand rested on Abel's shoulder. His hand found the small of her back. That difference in height, the thing folks used to laugh about, now felt like the most natural fit in the world. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "That I wasn't Clara?" Abel looked up at her, the strength in her jaw, the fire in her eyes, the same eyes that had seen the truth in him from the start, and smiled. "Every damn day," he said. "I thank God you weren't." She kissed him then, sure and slow. And right there, in the middle of their thriving ranch, with the land stretching wide and open like a promise, Abel Harkin finally understood what it meant to belong. Not to a place, not to a town's approval, but to a person. And that was more than enough. If you enjoyed this tale of grit and grace, click the next video for another unforgettable frontier story, where the Wild West doesn't just break people, it binds them together in ways no one expects. Subscribe and drop a super chat if you'd like to help us keep bringing you more true-hearted cowboy stories just like this one.